actresses of her day, known for her great beauty and said to be the inspiration for Catwoman and Snow White. But there was a part of her life that almost no one knew about. It turns out Hedy Lamarr was also a brilliant inventor.
She was the most beautiful woman in the world, a genius inventor, a Hollywood legend. But when Hedy Lamarr died, the truth about what she did to her own children shocked everyone. One was disowned at just 12 years old. One spent years fighting a legal battle he never should have had to fight. And one gave up everything to protect her legacy, only to be left with nothing.
Basic idea of frequency hopping became part of what's known as spread spectrum. Spread spectrum is what's in all of our technology today. I mean, Bluetooth is probably the most purely similar to what Hedy Lamarr invented, and Wi-Fi too. But spread spectrum is in...
The secrets she took to her grave changed 3 lives forever. What really happened behind closed doors will leave you speechless. Hedy Lamarr was one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood during the golden age of cinema. Born in Austria in 1914, she made her way to America and became a major film star through the 1930s and 1940s. Magazines called her the most beautiful woman in the world, and audiences across the globe agreed. She appeared in dozens of films, earned a reputation as one of the great screen actresses of her era, and lived a life that seemed, from the outside, to be the very definition of glamour. But behind the carefully managed image and the studio lights, Hedy Lamarr's personal life was far more complicated than any role she ever played on screen. She was married 6 times. She was also an inventor, holding a patent for a radio communication system that would eventually contribute to the development of technologies we use every day. And she was a mother. Hedy had 3 children, each of whom grew up in the long shadow cast by her fame. Their names were James, Denise, and Anthony. And the stories of their lives, shaped by proximity to one of Hollywood's biggest stars, are filled with moments that no screenwriter would dare make up. Abandonment, reunion, secret identities, DNA tests, legal battles, and a decades-long mission to repair a mother's reputation. This is the true story of Hedy Lamarr's 3 children. To understand what these 3 people experienced growing up, it helps to first understand the kind of mother Hedy was. By most accounts, she was not a steady or conventional parent. Her life moved fast. She changed husbands, changed homes, and changed careers multiple times over the decades. Her children were often left in the care of nannies or relatives while she was working on film sets or dealing with the pressures of public life. That does not mean she was indifferent to her children. There is plenty of evidence to suggest she loved them deeply. But love and stability are not always the same thing, and for James, Denise, and Anthony, the line between those 2 things was tested over and over again. The eldest of the 3 was James. His story begins in 1939, in the middle of one of the more unusual circumstances you could imagine. Hedy was between film projects at the time and had recently married her second husband, a screenwriter named Gene Markey. Shortly after the wedding, the couple brought a baby boy into their home and raised him as their own. Hedy always maintained that James was adopted. The adoption, she said, took place during her marriage to Markey, and she was consistent in that version of events throughout her life. Whether the adoption was formally registered or handled through more informal channels in the way that sometimes happened in that era is not entirely clear, but James came into Hedy's household as her son, and for a time that is exactly how things appeared to work. The marriage to Gene Markey did not last long. When it ended, Hedy fought to keep James. A custody arrangement was disputed in court, and Hedy won the right to raise him. By 1941, James was fully in her care. A couple of years later, Hedy married again, this time to a British actor named John Loder. Young James took his new stepfather's surname and became James Lamarr Loder. On paper, it looked like a stable family unit, a famous mother, a respected stepfather, and a young boy with a home in one of the most privileged corners of American society. But the reality was more difficult. As James grew older, things became strained between him and his mother. By the time he was around 9 years old, Hedy was finding him hard to manage. He was, according to accounts from that period, considered a problem child by the time he reached 3rd or 4th grade. The exact nature of his behavior is not fully documented, but the consequences of it were significant. James was eventually asked to leave the Chadwick School in California following some kind of incident. The school did not want him back. What happened next set in motion a chain of events that would define James's relationship with his mother for the rest of their lives. A teacher at the school, a woman named Ingrid Gray, stepped in with an offer. She and her husband were willing to let James live with them during the school year so that he could stay enrolled and remain close to his friends. For a young boy who had already experienced considerable upheaval, the prospect of keeping his friendships and his familiar surroundings was understandably appealing. James agreed to the arrangement. To Hedy, this felt like a rejection. In her mind, her son had chosen another family's home over hers. She was deeply hurt by the decision, and rather than finding a way through it, she withdrew. James later recalled that his mother became disenchanted with him after that choice and made it clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. In 1953, when James was around 12 years old, Hedy cut off contact entirely. She stopped responding to his letters. She returned the ones he sent. She refused to see him. Effectively, she disowned her own child while he was still in primary school. The timing makes this particularly striking. Just a few years before, Hedy had gone to court to fight for custody of James. She had argued in front of a judge that this boy should be with her, and then, within the space of a few years, she erased him from her life completely. What changed and what was going through her mind during that period is difficult to say with certainty. But the outcome was clear. A 12-year-old boy was left without his mother, and a silence fell between them that would stretch on for nearly half a century. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, because the human cost of what happened to James is easy to underestimate if you move through the details too quickly. He was not a teenager who had done something catastrophic. He was a child who had made a fairly understandable decision about where he wanted to go to school, and the response from his mother was total, permanent silence. No birthday cards, no phone calls, no visits. The woman who had once fought a legal battle to keep him simply stopped acknowledging that he existed. For James, this became the defining fact of his early life. He had been raised as the son of one of the most famous women in the world. And then, without warning, that connection was severed. He was left to grow up and make sense of it on his own. Despite everything that had happened, James did not fall apart. That might sound like a simple thing to say, but given the circumstances, it is worth acknowledging. He had been cast aside by his mother at the age of 12, left to navigate adolescence without the woman who had legally fought to keep him just a few years earlier. Many people in that position would have struggled to find their footing. James, by all accounts, found his. He grew up away from Hollywood. There were no film premieres, no studio connections, no inherited glamour to lean on. The world that Hedy Lamarr occupied, with its camera lights and magazine covers and carefully constructed public image, was simply not a part of his life anymore. In some ways, that distance probably helped him. He was not competing with a legend. He was just a young man trying to build something of his own, in his own corner of the country, far from California. By the 1960s, James had settled in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He became a police officer, a career that requires a specific kind of person: patient, steady, committed to the community, willing to show up when things are difficult. It is not a career associated with celebrity or inherited privilege. It is the kind of work that speaks to a person's character more than their background. Whatever James had carried with him from his childhood, whatever wounds he had accumulated from his years in Hedy's orbit and then outside of it, he channeled into something constructive. In 1967, he married a woman named Ona Minor. Together, they built a family, and not a small one. They had 4 children. James gave each of those children the middle name Lamarr. That detail is easy to read past, but it says a great deal about where James's head was, even decades after the falling out with his mother. He had been rejected, ignored, and eventually written out of her life. And yet he kept her name alive in his own family, passing it down to the next generation. Whether that was a gesture of forgiveness, a way of holding on to something he had lost, or simply a tribute to the significance of the Lamarr name, is impossible to say for certain. But it was deliberate. James chose to do that. Nobody made him. At the same time, something was quietly unsettled in James's understanding of his own history. Hedy had always said he was adopted. That had been her consistent position throughout her life. But as James got older and began to reflect more carefully on his past, he started to wonder whether that was actually true. The circumstances of his early life did not add up to him in the way they perhaps should have. The timing of his birth, the details of how he had come into Hedy's household, the fact that her third husband, John Loder, shared his surname. These things nagged at him. At some point in his adult life, James decided to look for answers. He tracked down a copy of his birth certificate, which, depending on how and where it was registered, could contain information that official adoption records might not. What he found appeared to confirm his suspicions. The certificate listed his mother as Hedwig Kiesler, which was Hedy Lamarr's birth name, and his father as John Loder. If that information was accurate, then James was not adopted at all. He was Hedy's biological child, born before she and John Loder were married, the product of an affair she had been conducting while still legally married to Jean Markey. From James's perspective, this changed everything. He had spent decades believing he was an adopted child who had been discarded. Now he believed he was a secret biological son, hidden away and lied to. The story he had been told about himself, the one Hedy had maintained her entire life, was in his view, a cover. She had not taken in a stranger's child out of generosity. She had concealed her own child's origins to protect her reputation at a time when an illegitimate birth would have been professionally and socially damaging for a Hollywood actress. Armed with this interpretation, James did something significant. He reached out to his mother. After nearly 40 years of silence, of returned letters and refused visits, he made contact. This happened in the late 1980s. He was by then in his late 40s or early 50s. Hedy was in her mid-70s. Whatever bitterness or hurt had defined the years of separation, James was willing to try. The reconnection came through a series of long-distance phone calls. James later described the experience with a warmth that is striking given the history between them. He said his mother's voice on the phone sounded lively and engaging, as though the decades had not dulled her at all. She struck him as sharp, charming, and fully present. At some point during this exchange, Hedy sent him a photograph. It was a picture of the two of them from his childhood, and she had written on it herself. The inscription read, to use a close rendering of her words, that she thought he would want a photo of them together, and she signed it with love, from Mum. It was a small thing in some ways, a photograph and a few words, but after 50 years of nothing, it carried enormous weight. It suggested that Hedy had not been entirely indifferent to what had happened between them, that somewhere she had kept this image of herself and her son from better times, and that she had wanted him to have it. Whether she felt genuine regret, or whether the gesture was her way of reaching across a divide without fully acknowledging it, is hard to know, but it meant something to James. Unfortunately, the reconciliation never went much further than that. There were no reunions, no long conversations that resolved the pain of what had happened. The phone calls and the photograph were as close as they got. In January 2000, Hedy Lamarr died in Florida at the age of 85. She had been living quietly and privately in her final years, largely withdrawn from public life. Her death was the end of any remaining possibility that James might have hoped for. What came after her death, however, turned James's story into something even more complicated. When Hedy's will was read, James discovered that she had left him nothing. The estate was divided between Denise and Anthony, her two other children. James was explicitly excluded. Given the history between them, this was perhaps not entirely surprising, but James was not willing to simply accept it, particularly given what he believed he now knew about his own origins. He challenged the will in court. His argument was straightforward, at least from his perspective. If he was Hedy's biological firstborn child, then he had a legitimate claim to a share of her estate. He had been deceived about his origins, excluded from his own inheritance, and now he was seeking what he believed was rightfully his. The legal dispute put him in direct conflict with Denise and Anthony, the two half-siblings he had never been particularly close to. To resolve the matter, a DNA test was arranged. The science was by that point reliable enough to settle the question definitively. And when the results came back, they did exactly that. The DNA test showed that James was not biologically related to Hedy Lamarr, nor was he biologically related to John Loder. The birth certificate that had seemed to confirm his suspicions, whatever it actually said and however it had come to be registered that way, was not an accurate record of his biological parentage. Hedy had been telling the truth all along. James was adopted. He was not her flesh and blood. It is difficult to imagine what that moment felt like. For years, James had carried the belief that he had uncovered a hidden truth about himself. He had built a narrative around it, one in which he was not an abandoned adoptee, but a secret son whose origins had been deliberately concealed. That narrative had given him a way of making sense of the rejection, a reason for it that went beyond a mother simply choosing not to want him. And then, in a laboratory result, it collapsed entirely. The legal dispute was settled after the DNA results were confirmed. James agreed to drop his claim in exchange for a payment from the estate, reported to be around $50,000. It was a resolution of sorts, though not the one he had sought. He returned to his life in the Midwest, to his family and his community, and largely kept his thoughts about the whole affair to himself. In the interviews he gave over the years, he did not speak badly about his mother. The pain was there if you looked for it, but he did not perform it for public consumption. James Lamarr Loder died in 2022 at the age of 84 in Omaha, Nebraska. He had outlived his mother by more than 20 years. He had built a life that stood entirely on its own, without the support or the name of a Hollywood star behind it. He had raised a family, served his community, and carried the weight of a complicated history without letting it define him entirely. The questions about who he really was, where he came from, and what his biological origins actually were never fully answered. That part of the story remains open. While James was living out his complicated and often painful relationship with his mother from a distance, Hedy's second child was having a very different experience. Denise was born on the 19th of January, 1945, during Hedy's marriage to British actor John Loder. Unlike James, whose origins would later become the subject of legal disputes and DNA tests, Denise's place in the family was never in question. She was Hedy and John's biological daughter, and from the beginning, the bond between mother and child was warmer and more straightforward than anything Hedy had managed with James. Denise came into the world at an interesting moment in her mother's career. Hedy was still very much an active presence in Hollywood, and the films she was making at the time were among the most commercially successful of her life. But the arrival of a baby represented something different from the world of studios and screen tests. It was a domestic chapter, a moment where Hedy was, at least in part, simply a mother with a young child at home. How long that chapter lasted and how fully Hedy was able to inhabit it is another question entirely. It did not last long. Hedy and John Loder divorced in 1947 when Denise was just 2 years old. The reasons behind the breakdown of that marriage, like most things in Hedy's personal life, were layered and complicated. What mattered for Denise and her younger brother Anthony, who had been born just months before the divorce, was that their father was no longer a constant presence in the home. From that point on, it was largely Hedy who was responsible for raising them, though in practice that often meant a rotating cast of nannies, relatives, and household staff doing much of the day-to-day work, while Hedy managed her career and her increasingly turbulent personal life. Hedy would go on to marry 3 more times after divorcing John Loder. For Denise and Anthony, that meant a series of new stepfathers arriving and departing, new addresses, new schools, and a general atmosphere of change that was never entirely settled. It was not an upbringing built on stability. But there is an important distinction to make here, and it is one that Denise herself has reinforced in the accounts she has given over the years. Despite the chaos of Hedy's personal life, despite the marriages and the moves and the professional pressures, Hedy loved her children. She was not always present in the way a more conventional mother might have been, but her affection for Denise and Anthony was genuine. Denise has spoken about her mother with real warmth, describing a softer, more private side of Hedy that the public rarely got to see. That warmth shaped Denise in ways that are visible when you look at the choices she made as she grew up. She was not drawn to the entertainment industry. She was not chasing fame or trying to replicate her mother's career. Instead, from a relatively young age, Denise found her way to art. She had a natural ability with drawing and painting that became apparent during her school years, and she pursued it seriously rather than treating it as a casual hobby. By the time she was a teenager, she had already won several art awards and had held her first gallery showing while still in high school. That is not a small achievement for someone of that age, regardless of who their mother happens to be. When Denise was 16, she was given an opportunity that most young artists could only dream of. She traveled to Paris to study art for 6 months. This would have been in the early 1960s, a period when Paris was still regarded as one of the great centers of the art world, carrying the weight of decades of creative history and still buzzing with contemporary energy. During her time there, Denise mixed with artists who were actively pushing the boundaries of their craft, among them the American painter Larry Rivers, who was associated with the New York School and known for blending abstract and figurative styles. She also spent time absorbing the French Impressionist works that filled the city's galleries and museums. For a teenager from Hollywood who was still forming her artistic identity, it was an extraordinarily rich environment to be immersed in. She returned to the United States with a clearer sense of who she was and what she wanted to do. She enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, as an art major. By this point, Hedy's film career was beginning to slow down. The era of the great Hollywood studios was changing, and Hedy, like many actresses of her generation, was finding fewer roles that suited her. The financial security and the social status that came with being a major film star were becoming less certain. Denise, to her credit, did not seem to be looking to her mother's world for a blueprint. She was at her easel, developing her technique and her voice as a painter, building something that was entirely her own. In 1966, at the age of 21, Denise got married. Her husband was a man named Larry Colton, who had briefly pitched for the Philadelphia Phillies before moving into writing. The two had met at university. Their wedding was attended by Hedy herself, and photographs from the occasion show a proud mother at her daughter's side. It is a striking image when you consider how different Hedy's relationship with James had been. Here was a version of Hedy that the public rarely saw. Not a film star on a red carpet, but a mother at her daughter's wedding, dressed for the occasion and beaming. After the wedding, Denise moved with Larry to the Pacific Northwest, settling in the Seattle area. It was about as far from Hollywood as you could get while still remaining in the continental United States, and that distance seemed to suit Denise well. She was not hiding from her mother's fame exactly, but she was not trading on it either. She was living a quiet life, raising a family, and continuing to make art. She and Larry had a daughter together named Wendy, who became Hedy Lamarr's first grandchild. People who knew Denise during those years in Seattle described her as content. She was a mother, an artist, and someone who had found a way to live peacefully despite the complications of her background. While Hedy's own life in that same period was generating headlines for all the wrong reasons, including a well-publicized shoplifting incident in the late 1960s and a ghost-written autobiography that caused considerable controversy, Denise kept her head down and stayed out of it. She was not interested in the drama. She had her family and her work, and that was enough. Her marriage to Larry Colton eventually ended in divorce in the early 1970s, but Denise remained in Seattle. The city had become her home in a genuine sense. She had put down roots there, built friendships, and found a community. Some years after the divorce from Colton, she remarried. Her second husband was an Italian-American man with the surname Duca, which is how she eventually came to be known as Denise Loda Duca, the name by which most people familiar with her story recognize her today. Through the changes in her personal life, art remained the one constant. Denise became an art teacher in Seattle, passing on her knowledge and her enthusiasm to students while continuing to develop her own practice. She held gallery showings throughout the 1970s and 1980s, gradually building a genuine reputation in the local arts community. This was not a celebrity's daughter dabbling in a hobby. This was a working artist with a body of serious work, earning recognition on its own terms. As the decades passed and attitudes towards Hedy Lamarr began to shift, Denise found herself in an unexpected position. For much of Hedy's lifetime, the conversation about her had been almost entirely focused on her looks. She was the most beautiful woman in the world. That was the headline, and it was the one that stuck. Her scientific work, the frequency-hopping patent she had developed during the Second World War that laid important groundwork for modern wireless communication technologies, had been largely overlooked or dismissed during her lifetime. It was only in the 1990s when researchers and technology historians began to look more closely at the origins of things like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi that Hedy's contributions started to be taken seriously. Denise watched this shift happen and stepped into a gentle but meaningful role as a keeper of her mother's story. She began appearing at events celebrating Hedy's legacy, speaking about her mother as a person rather than a symbol. She was not doing this loudly or in pursuit of attention. She was doing it because she had known Hedy in a way that most people had not, and she wanted the fuller picture to be available to those who were curious about who Hedy Lamarr really was. Today, Denise Loda Duca is in her late 70s. She still lives in the Seattle area, and by all accounts, she is still active as an artist. She participates in local gallery events and art walks, and her identity as a painter remains central to how she presents herself to the world. She is, in the most straightforward sense, a person who made her own life. She took the complicated circumstances of her childhood, the famous mother, the absent fathers, the shifting homes, and she built something stable and creative out of them. That is not a small thing. And it is perhaps the most honest tribute to a woman who, despite all the noise and the glamour and the chaos, clearly left a mark on her daughter that went well beyond the surface. Anthony Loder was born on the 1st of February, 1947, just a few months before his parents' marriage fell apart. He was the second biological child of Hedy and John Loder, and Hedy's third child overall if you count James. Like Denise, Anthony grew up in a household shaped by his mother's fame, her string of marriages, and the particular kind of instability that tends to follow people who live their lives at high speed. He was too young to remember his father being in the home. John Loder was gone before Anthony was old enough to form any real memory of him. And so from very early on, Anthony's world was essentially Hedy, whatever man she happened to be married to at the time, and Denise. Despite the unsettled nature of his upbringing, Anthony spoke warmly about his mother throughout his life. He adored her. He was also, as he got older, increasingly aware of the gap between how the world saw her and who she actually was. The public saw a glamorous actress, a beautiful face on a cinema screen. Anthony saw someone more complicated and more interesting than that. As a teenager, he learned about the patent she had developed during the Second World War, a frequency-hopping communication system designed to make radio-guided torpedoes harder to detect and jam. The technology was decades ahead of its time, and the principles behind it would eventually contribute to the development of wireless communication systems that billions of people rely on today. But during Hedy's lifetime, that contribution was almost entirely ignored. The world wanted to talk about her looks, not her mind. Anthony found that deeply frustrating, and that frustration would quietly shape the direction of much of his adult life. In his younger years, Anthony tried acting. He had the looks for it, tall and striking in a way that recalled his father, and he had the right connections simply by virtue of who his mother was. He made his stage debut in his early 20s in a production in Palm Beach, Florida, and received encouraging notices. There was even a moment that came close to something bigger. He auditioned for a role in the 1970 film Love Story, going up for the part of a college roommate that ultimately went to a then largely unknown Tommy Lee Jones. It was a near miss that he later reflected on with good humor. Acting, he eventually concluded, was not his path. He lacked either the hunger or the circumstances to push through the relentless competition of the industry, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize that. He moved into production work for a time, contributing to small film and television projects behind the scenes. Eventually, he left the entertainment world altogether and found his footing in the telephone and communications industry in California. There is something quietly poetic about that. Hedy had spent decades being denied recognition for her contribution to communication technology, and her son ended up building his professional life in that same field. Anthony worked for technology companies through the 1980s and 1990s, a period when the industry was expanding rapidly, and he built a comfortable and stable life for himself in Los Angeles. But the work that defined Anthony's later years had nothing to do with his career. It was his campaign to ensure that Hedy Lamarr was remembered properly. By the 1990s, academics and technology historians were finally beginning to acknowledge the significance of her wartime patent, and Anthony was determined to make sure that acknowledgement went as far as it possibly could. In 1997, Hedy received an award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, recognizing her contribution to the development of communication technology. She was in her 80s by then and not well enough to attend the ceremony in person. Anthony accepted the award on her behalf and used the occasion to speak about her intelligence and her vision, making the case to anyone who would listen that his mother deserved to be remembered as a pioneer, not just a pretty face from old Hollywood. When Hedy died in January 2000 at the age of 85, Anthony and Denise honored her final wish by traveling to Austria and scattering her ashes in the Vienna woods outside the city where she had grown up. It was a private and deeply personal act, captured in part by a documentary camera, and the footage of Anthony and his sister releasing their mother's ashes among the trees is one of the more moving images associated with Hedy's story. She had fled Austria decades earlier, driven out by the rise of the Nazi regime and a suffocating first marriage. Returning her to that landscape, even in death, felt like a form of completion. Antony did not stop there. He noticed that despite her global fame, Hedy had no permanent memorial in Vienna, the city of her birth. He found that unacceptable and set about trying to change it. What followed was a 14-year process of lobbying, negotiating, and pushing against bureaucratic resistance until the city of Vienna agreed to grant Hedy an honorary grave in the central cemetery. The grave was established in 2014, and a portion of her ashes were interred there in a ceremony that drew considerable attention. It was the kind of recognition that Hedy had deserved for a long time, and it would not have happened without Antony's persistence. He also worked as a co-producer on a documentary about his mother called Calling Hedy Lamarr, made with Austrian filmmaker Georg Misch and released in 2004. The film used a creative and slightly unconventional approach, following Antony as he called people named Hedy Lamarr listed in phone directories, using those encounters as a way of exploring how his mother's name and image had rippled out into the world. It also drew on personal archives, home videos, and Antony's own recollections to paint a portrait of Hedy in her final years that was honest about her struggles, including the painful consequences of repeated cosmetic surgery while remaining fundamentally loving in its intentions. In his later years, Antony was working on a project to establish a permanent museum and cultural space in Vienna dedicated to his mother. Plans emerged around 2021 for a high-end venue on one of Vienna's main shopping streets that would feature a permanent exhibition of Hedy's personal belongings alongside a cafe where visitors could learn about her life. He was still actively involved in moving that project forward right up until the end of his life, making calls and sending emails about it, even as his health declined. Antony Loder died in May 2023 at the age of 76. He had spent the better part of his adult life making sure his mother was not forgotten, and because of that, she is not. Her name appears on parks and public spaces. Her story is taught in science classrooms. Her patent is cited in serious discussions about the history of wireless technology. That did not happen by accident, it happened because her son refused to let it go.